You're watching NewsX. I'm Rishabh Gulati. We're interrupting our coverage of the major political domestic developments in the Indian state of Bihar to address a conversation which is a difficult one. And the reason it's difficult is because all of us across the globe have to at least attempt and aspire for the principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that the world is one family. Human beings, you and I, for reasons and pretexts, excuses, do nasty things to one another, whether as individuals or groups or communities or even sometimes nation states. Nasty things take place. When the assumption was that the world was run as Europe at its center, an attempt was made with the League of Nations to have a forum, a quorum for conversation so that more things can be discussed, more things can be sorted out. We all know how that ended up. So another attempt was made in 1945, where the powers of that time took up unto themselves not only the task of creating a global body, which by essence is a noble and altruistic one, but to control the strings of the global body, to create a democratic UN General Assembly, which every nation state, no matter how big or small, has a vote, but have it under the boot heel of the United Nations Security Council, in which 5 nations either decide or not decide on everything on the planet. 1945. Here we are, 80 years later. How's it going? You can well argue that however imperfect or prone to issue the system, we don't have any other, nor even the prospects of any other. The United Nations is the best we've got, so despite whatever happens, we have to stick with it. And that's not an unreasonable argument. That's all we've got. But ladies and gentlemen, in 1996, there was a $10 billion oil for food scandal on a UN mission or UN mandated mission in Iraq. There have been tens of thousands of sexual abuse allegations in various UN interventions in Africa. Tens of thousands. All of us who've lived for the past 4 years will find it very difficult that the next time a Tedros and the WHO stand up about some disease or pandemic emerging from China and tell us, don't worry, it's all good. We'll find it very difficult to believe. 6 million people are dead, probably more, while they kept telling us, don't worry, all's good, all's good. And like it or not, have you seen some WHO restructuring take place? No, you haven't. It's the same people, the same boss. So what's happened? Why are we having this conversation? What you're seeing on your screens is a scandal that's hit one of the UN refugee agencies operating in Gaza. This is called the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the UNRWA. It was founded in 1948 specifically to operate in Palestinian areas. It's employed about 12,000 people, mostly Palestinians. And now, even though the charge sheet has not been made public yet, the comments of the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, pretty much say it in one line, and I'm quoting, "Any UN employee involved in acts of terror will be held accountable, including through criminal prosecution, unquote. This means, ladies and gentlemen, in effect, that 12 UN employees of this agency, the UNRWA, were not only aiding and abetting Hamas, they were in fact conducting terror strikes into Israel. Now, I'm told 9 of these people have had their contracts terminated. Okay. 1 of them has died, and 2 of them are still under investigation. As a consequence of this, 9 major countries, including the UK and the US, have withdrawn funding from the UNRWA, which of course has a bearing for those people who will very rightly and altruistically say that there is no other agency providing the scope of humanitarian assistance which is required. And if the funding goes away, what happens to the other employees who are mostly Palestinians? What happened to the work that they were doing, which is mostly benefiting Palestinians who are facing devastation? The cause and consequence of the devastation, we can argue, let's not take away that there is a problem. People are dying. So what do we do? Let's open up this conversation. Major General Dhruv Kato joining us on the broadcast. Professor Madhav Nalapat is with us. Pathikrit is joining us on the broadcast as well. Professor Nalapat, many UN officials, either rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, have a reputation of a very comfortable life, tax-free employment at global taxpayers' expense. But a lot of them do very difficult, hard work on the ground. They're very motivated people who put aside their lives and other career opportunities and try their best at solving the problems the world creates. So a sweeping brush is perhaps a bit unfair. There are 12,000 employees in this UNRWA, which has been operating there for better part of 70 years. But what do we do when 12 of them are part of a terror attack like what happened on October 7th? How do we absorb this and what do we do with it, sir?
Well, Rishabh, in the first place, I'd like to point out that, as you correctly said, the UN has been doing very good work in very many locations. And the agency that we are talking about, UNRWA, it is because of that agency that Gazans are not dying of starvation. Now, I don't believe the operations of the agency are going to stop. Other countries are going to step in and ensure that the funding continues, in spite of the cut in funding by some countries. But I'm frankly shocked and horrified by this. And I'm frankly surprised at the reaction of the administrator of UNRWA on this matter, because this is not a simple matter. It's a question of terrorists basically getting into, a UN agency and conducting acts of terror. Now, for all you know, there may be other individuals there who have not been identified so far. And the worry is, supposing, for example, in the past, transportation of relief goods given by UNRWA, and it's done human service to the people of Gaza. Supposing these were used not to transport goods meant for the civilian population, but other kinds of goods, using the UN shield, frankly, and the UN name to conduct terror operations is a crime beyond description. And in my personal view, I think the Secretary General needs to basically hold the administrator of UNRWA to account. Now, though it's obvious that those who indulge in acts of terror, 9 out of 12, you're saying, 2 out of 12, 9, have been terminated. Well, that's the least that can be done. Now, the stable door has not been bolted, after the horse has run away. The fact is that there needs to be a complete examination of who else could be there in this kind, with this kind of a mindset, because the mindset of a terrorist is entirely different from the mindset of a humanitarian worker, which is what UNRWA is. Now, having said that, I'd like to say, very, very clearly that I think the administrator of this organization needs to be held to account for failing to see what was going on under his nose, so to speak. And secondly, when you're dealing in a territory that is run by a terror group, and make no bones about it, Hamas is a terror group. You have to have a very high level of vetting of your staff because you're giving them extraordinary privileges, very, very important privileges that can be, if they are misused in a malign way, it can be very harmful. So on the whole, Rishabh, I'd like to say I'm a bit disappointed at the response of the UNRWA administration to this point of view.
Okay.
But I fully agree the work it is doing is excellent and it needs to continue, and I'm sure it will continue.
Okay, which is why it's an onion of the issue. It's an onion on the issue not only at the very core level of just what has happened here, because exactly this, there will be people there, mostly Palestinians, who are employed, who are doing crucial services under the umbrella of the UN, which is the privilege that Professor Nalapat was saying, because if you have that UN logo on your vehicle, if you have a UN identity card, you are taken with a degree of trust that you are involved in humanitarian operations. If you wear your UN ID card and then are caught across a border, killing, raping, then you do a lot of damage to the credibility of the organization and the thousands of other people. At the larger level, and I mentioned this is not just about perception of UN staffers living in capitals in all over the world, tax-free salaries. This is about the people who join the United Nations, and there are many such who are devoted. It's not about the money for them. It's not about the perks and privileges and the travel opportunities. It's not about the CV points. They are genuinely devoted to the better cause of humanity. But the structure of the United Nations, as I mentioned, has delivered to you the United Nations run oil for food scandal. Maybe $2 billion siphoned off. It was a scandal not so long ago. I would be presumptuous enough to say that what happened with the World Health Organization 4 years ago was nothing short of a scandal. Millions of people died. We were more than just misled. Now you have another scandal, General Katoch. It's a difficult one at the core level of just this agency and the humanitarian operations it's conducting in Gaza. It's a major issue, a crisis of confidence in the United Nations as well. How do we now bifurcate, disaggregate, and address these problems? Because the United Nations takes billions in funding from all over the world. In many regards, it is dysfunctional, but it also has a lot of people who really, really mean well for the world. And at the same time, it's all we've got.
Thank you, Rishabh. Rishabh, I think what has happened as far as UNRWA is concerned is a very, very serious matter of concern. You see, unlike an earlier case where the money was siphoned off, which is simply petty theft, if you say $1 billion or a few $1 billion have been siphoned off, that is simply petty theft. Here we have crossed the boundary of petty theft and moved into the realms of terrorism. And while 9 to 12 people have been, the services of 9 people of UNRWA have been terminated, the question is, if 9 people have been involved, there will be a much larger circle with whom they operated with. It cannot be simply confined to a very secret operation within these 9. That is not the way terrorism operates. And as they were all Palestinians who were there, I think it is a cause of very serious concern. Professor Madhav Nalpat is right. You see, there is no accountability at the highest level. The very first step which should have been taken is to have suspended the services of the entire leadership of UNRWA. Now we are asking those very same people to carry out an inquiry, they are going to cover their backs. As far as the funding is concerned, you see, if the Western nations are giving funding, I presume they are entitled to ask for it. They are entitled to ask that the funding be correctly spent. And if they have any doubts that it is going into the hands of terrorists, well, I personally won't blame them for suspending suspending funding for the time being. Another issue which arises, which struck me quite hard, this issue, UNRWA has been in existence for about 70 years now. What have they been doing for 70 years? Why has it continued for 70 years? The problem should have been resolved by now. Those refugees of 1948, are they still refugees today? If so, then the UN has done a very, very poor and shoddy job. You cannot have certain organizations continuing in perpetuity on the very nice grounds of humanism and looking after the welfare and poor people, etc., etc. That sounds very good. But then, is that welfare where you have got to make people subsist for 70 years instead of making them self-sufficient?
Yeah.
So there is something basically wrong in what has been done. But I personally am a votary of saying, if there is terrorism involved, we need to get to the bottom of it. And for the countries who have suspended this aid, in my view, it is appropriate for the moment till such time as greater clarity comes about. Yeah. And it is up to the Palestinians now to determine which side they are on. They have been continuously, either due to fear, inducement, or due to any other cause, supporting the Hamas. I think the time has now come to call it right. Listen, no more. Rishabh.
Okay, all right. Pathikrit, so now it's a difficult one, right? You can argue on all sides of the coin for the next 80 years, as we have for the last 80 years, that the United Nations is all you've got. There are a lot of people in the United Nations who join these agencies, who go and work in difficult circumstances and are really keen on a better place. And that's what they devote, sometimes risk their lives for. At the same time, you have a history, Pathikrit, of failed, dysfunctional administration. And the UN argues, well, what can we do? We have no powers. I mean, what was UNRWA doing here for all those decades? What are the UN observers doing on the Israel-Lebanon border, for example? They're just hanging out and filing reports and getting paid for filing reports that I don't know if anybody reads. So let's start with the local issue on this issue itself. Pathikrit, if 12 UN employees are found carrying guns and killing people, we don't know the full extent of the charges, but when we are being told they took part in the attack, I'm assuming that's what it means, right?
Rishabh, you're absolutely right. Let me tell you, first of all, UN, if you ask me my personal opinion, it's basically a dysfunctional organization, which is a great place to start your career with. Otherwise, there is nothing much I expect from that organization. You mentioned about Antonio Guterres and his statement that those who were involved, what UN will do to them and whatever. But this was the same man, after the October 7 attack, he literally gave moral justification. He stated the October 7 attack did not happen in a vacuum. He was giving some kind of a cover fire to what Hamas was doing. Secondly, if you look at the whole of United Nations today, if you peel layer after layer, as you rightly mentioned about the onion thing, you will find a problem in each of these. Let me tell you, you again mentioned about WHO. WHO sent a team to Wuhan to investigate about the virus. There was a man in that team who was one of the leaders in that team. His name was Peter Daszak. Peter Daszak was the president of an organization called EcoHealth Alliance, the same organization whose activities were being questioned because the rise and the spark of COVID-19. His whole object, whatever EcoHealth Alliance does, has been directly connected with the spread and proliferation of the COVID virus across the world and outsourcing of the entire, gain of function research to Wuhan, which was done from United States. So this is what WHO is. Number 3, does UN even consider Hamas a terror organization? Those who are working in Palestine on behalf of UNRWA, do they consider Hamas as a terror organization or as a freedom fighting organization? You mentioned about the presence of UN groups and observers in JNK. Let me tell you, Rishabh, I don't know if these guys ever even took up a gun to to shoot at an LAT terrorist. They have never. They were the first to run into the bunkers whenever there was a problem. So, United Nations, I once asked somebody that you call yourself a peacekeeping force. Have you ever created peace anywhere? He said, no, we are not to create peace. We just want to maintain the status quo. So wherever, whether it's a Lebanon, whether it's in Lebanon or in Kashmir or in, they have always been in sync with the rebel rousers. Otherwise, their own existence will be in question. So I think fundamentally, we need a major reform in the multilateral institutions led by United Nations. It doesn't mean that you wipe out and ban UN. But unless you reform, unless you bring accountability, and last but not the least, Rishabh, are we to believe that the donors to UN till date were not aware of what was happening in Palestine and Gaza?
Okay.
I mean, these organizations were operating in the same hospitals in whose bunkers Hamas was having its control rooms and operational control rooms. Are we to believe US, Finland, Germany were not aware of it? So I think today they have something else coming up because of which they need to project them as bad guys, which is fine. They are not very good guys. But all along, everybody has played along.
Okay, so here's the problem, and it's a fundamental problem. I don't have, and I try my best often to apply my mind to at least offer some solution, some path ahead. So let's be hopeful. But what do we do? So UN peacekeeping operations, they've been there. India has contributed troops. If you are a local commander for UN peacekeeping force, your terms of engagement are so complex that yes, in most cases you run away. There was a UN peacekeeping mission that was in Rwanda. 500,000 people died as they sat there. And in the end, you can argue that they didn't have the mandate, they didn't have the SOP, they couldn't intervene, they didn't have the resources, people, ammunition. You can argue whatever you want. But the point is, it has just become a rubber stamp. Now the question is, whose rubber stamp? Let me get Dr. Rao into this. Dr. Rao, you can well argue that at some point of time, certain WHO officials, were they working for the World Health Organization and the betterment of humanity, or were they working for Chinese interests? Now I don't know whether the UNRWA, whether they are working for the humanity of the Palestinian people and their aid, or they are working for Hamas. Now, next time somebody shows me a UN identity card, what do I look at it with? How do we address this?
Good evening, Rishabh, all panelists and viewers. See, there are certain basic problems with the United Nations organizations. One, the P5 is pulling all the strings. The financiers are pulling on all the strings. And nations like China and many of these other organizations have infiltrated UN's various branches, whatever suits them. And this is where the problem arises. And this is why people are going on, especially our nation is going on asking for reforms. This is a post-World War II organization. Otherwise, like the League of Nations, which was formed after World War I, if there is another, the way things are, we are having wars all over the place. It looks like we will have to have a totally new organization if they don't reform it. They either reform or they become getting totally irrelevant. WHO is totally infiltrated by the Chinese. And this is why that Wuhan visit was all their own.
So Dr. Robert, here's the problem, right? So you say, okay, so WHO, the US says, we're going to stop funding you, all right?
Yes.
That's the answer. Yes. Then the Chinese simply infiltrated even further, and the United Nations becomes a de facto rubber stamp for what China wants the world to be told. So now when you withdraw funding from this organization, there'll be others who come and say that we'll fund it, and then the UN becomes a further rubber stamp of some savory or some unsavory elements. What do we do? It's damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yes. So we need to completely reform the organization and give enough representation to the various groups. It's only when when UN starts and its organizations start representing the entire world and not only P5 or only some donors, that is when the things is going to change. If you are going to be stuck with only a few nations or a few organizations controlling the whole thing, it is not going to work.
Okay.
Every UN organization is slowly, one by one, losing its reputation. They have done great work in the past, but now things are really deteriorating, and the whole reputation of UN is at stake.
No, the truth is, you will struggle to find an example of great work. You will really struggle, done under the aegis of the United Nations across all its agencies, despite, like I said, a lot of good people, well-meaning people working there. And you can argue is because the structure is so complexly non-committal that anyway, with the best of intent, even if you wanted to do good work, you can't do it. So you can argue that way. So General Katoch, then let's move on to the next fundamental question. The fundamental question is this. Yes, it can happen that Indian intelligence does the best vetting operations and the best intelligence operations, yet something goes wrong and a terrorist sneaks through. It can happen that we expect the most loyal and patriotic people to take up service in our country, but some of them turn out to be spies. These can happen despite the best. So, is it that something slipped the net? And yes, it is a major scandal, but that's all it is. Or do we now need to have deep suspicion on the activities of the UNRWA? What are they doing with their money? If they are supplying food and medicine, where is it going? Who does it go to? Who are the beneficiaries of it? Are they aiding and abetting Hamas? Are there more people taking up arms? Was it only these 9 people, or is the entire organization riddled with Hamas? How do we disaggregate these 2 points?
Rishabh, the way I've looked at it is the UNRWA has 13,000 employees. I think that is too much. You see, if it is simply a question of giving relief material or to carry out certain specific works, you do not require 13,000 employees for a refugee population which is not that large, about 200,000 or 300,000 refugees. So why do you have such a large organization? That is the first point. The second point is, once this suspicion has set in, you see, this organization is dedicated to the Palestinian refugees. And who are employed? Palestinians. Whom do they have a crib against? An angst against Israel, against the West. So obviously their very mental makeup is really on those lines. So I don't think this problem can be resolved that easily. There is a fundamental problem involved, and unless there are appropriate checks and balances, I think it's not going to work.
Okay.
And those checks and balances mean that the number of employees who are Palestinian, that has to be dramatically and drastically reduced. And other people who are, let us say, if there are Indians there. Now, the Indians are not going to be swayed either by the West or the Palestinians. So I think those things have to be considered when putting in people there.
Yeah, so do we know what so is it simply serving as an employment agency? Because you can argue that as well, that you are pumping money into the Palestinian family hands, and that is its own good and bad argument can happen. But here's the bottom line. Professor Nalapat, you and I can't answer this question on the basis of limited information from third parties that we have through the international press. But what do? Do we then assume that yes, in a large network of a global network and a local level 13,000 employees, a dozen slipped through the cracks and it's an error that needs to be corrected? Or does it raise suspicions that where there were 12, there might be 1,200? We just simply don't know.
Well, Rishabh, first of all, I'd like to say that I have met some outstanding people in the UN system, in UNESCO, for example. But having said that, I'd like to say that this kind of a situation, frankly, now look at, for example, what's happening in Gaza. The people there are for various reasons, unemployed. And yet you have an exceptionally high birth rate there. Why? Because aid is distributed to them in a very efficient way, I'd like to say. And as a consequence, even if you don't have an income, you will, and the more people there are in the family, the higher the aid that you get. Now, frankly, that's a dynamic and then there are more people crowding that particular small territory. So this is a dynamic which is a problem. You've seen this problem in Scandinavia, for example, where you have some individuals who basically, they have very large families because based on the size of the family, many countries provide welfare, and that welfare is enough. They don't go to work. Now we have to find out a way for a two-state solution in which one, Hamas is completely eliminated from any kind of role in Gaza, and two, the Palestinian Authority is in a way is transformed into an efficient basis so that the Palestinian people can live normal lives. This is an extremely abnormal situation in which you have people who have basically no work and yet have the highest birth rate in the world. So there is something fundamentally wrong with some of the structures in place. And I'd like to say that also what is wrong is the fact that 90%, if not 95% of people in Palestine or people in Gaza do not like Hamas. But then they're all now, victims of that particular terror organization. So we need to work out a system in which Israel also, together with the UN, together with other countries, the system is worked out in which the Palestinians can have gainful work and gainful opportunity. And if you have a system, and at the same time, the minority there who are against Israel, and those who are indulging in terror operations, they need to be identified and severely punished. But the point is, an entire population cannot, of course, be held responsible, but at the same time, the lack of attention and the failure to identify terrorists and terror sympathizers in Gaza is a failure at various levels, and we are paying a price.
Clearly something very serious has gone wrong, and the consequences, but again, particularly, what do we do? I mean, India spends contributes about $32 million just directly to the UN as part of our budgetary expenditure, and of course, there's also aid to the agencies. It's going up. So what do we do? I mean, what is the solution to this? Because that's all you've got. You don't have any other international organization.
Rishabh, I think over a period of time, if UN refuses to transform, alternate mechanisms will come out. I think in case of Turkey, we have seen that India as a first respondent did far better job than what UN could have done. Secondly, if you look at United Nations, it cannot solve a dispute. It does not have a dispute resolution mechanism. It cannot prevent pandemics. It does not have a pandemic prevention mechanism. It cannot solve an issue. Perhaps it doesn't want to solve an issue. So it's a commercial entity which sustains on its own. It co-opts all the rebel rousers and terror organizations wherever it exists. So it's a commercial entity where people are highly paid. So frankly speaking, as you asked, that if the Americans and the West stops funding them, and invariably the vacuum is filled up by the likes of China, I'm sorry for my words, but in that case, if that is what UN does, then it means that it pimps for the highest bidder. So in that case, I think organized countries like India must, instead of spending that money, $32 million for anywhere else, should develop its own dispute resolution mechanism. It has become the voice of the global south. It has shown in case of pandemic or in kinds of natural disasters that as a first respondent, it does a far better work than many others. So I think G20 and other organizations are becoming more prominent because people are losing their faith in United Nations as an organization.
All right. Okay. I don't know. It's not one that is easy to draw conclusion on. I'll leave the last word with Dr. Rao. Dr. Rao, 12 people can slip the net. Okay, you can have the best counterintelligence and at a nation state level, and yet we find collaborators and we find spies and we find people who hide the RDX for the LET in Vantipura. Okay, so yes, things can slip the net, or there can be a fundamental problem. And my issue right now is if 12 people slip the net, okay, but I don't know. Is it just 12? Is it 1,000? Is it others? Is it only in Gaza? Is it elsewhere? Is it in other agencies? Who are these people working for? What do they stand for? Because even if 90% of UN staffers across the globe are in it for altruistic reasons, and a few thousand are in it for other purposes, it can be devastating. And we saw with Tedros, it was devastating.
I think UN, if it really wanted, could learn from the way things have changed in India. We had these similar problems in India. And Rajiv Gandhi as Prime Minister had even admitted that most of the money was leaking. So digitization, specific identification, sending the money to the true needy, these kind of things can be done. But the problem is, are they willing to learn from us? Or are they going to just go on with the way they are? I'm just hoping that exposing these shortcomings will help. And like Professor Nalapat said, there have been very nice things that have been done by UN organizations. The WHO itself managed to stamp out smallpox. It also, the United Agriculture Organization also has had a great role to play worldwide. And there are UNESCO itself. There are so many organizations which are doing good work. So I fully agree with you that a majority of them are there for altruistic reasons. But we have to avoid leakages and we have to avoid infiltration of the organization. So the funding, we can't allow a situation where people are infiltrating the organization or where people through funding are influencing the whole organization.
Okay.
These are things which need reform. And I think the present Indian government has set a very nice example. If UN wants, it can follow that example.
Okay.
And this relief agency, for earthquakes, for various other, for rescuing people, so many other things, we are doing a great job. And
So let me, for an audience watching that might be not privy or living in India, despite the conversations we are having here in a free press, the Indian government is improving its contributions, on-time contributions to all the UN agencies, including the budgetary contribution that we make from our federal budget to the UN. It's at $31 million. That does not include other assistance supplied to other UN programs. In fact, as we speak, despite my suspicion and credibility with the World Health Organization under its current chief, he was invited for the G20. He was given the red carpet. A brand new office for the WHO is being built in the national capital. So as stated policy, commitment to UN agencies from India has been unwavered. It has increased regardless of our position about UNSC reform. So this conversation is happening, which is of an academic nature. But the reason it is serious because there is no now denying that this is a massive scandal hitting a UN agency. We've seen too many of them. Now, I'll leave it to you to be the judge of people watching. That is it because the UN in fact requires more empowerment, or does it require complete restructuring? And there are people working there, have worked there, involved in this, who now really need to rise to that challenge, because this is untenable. You can't have UN employees who then become terror convicts. I thank my guests. We take a break.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.